What would you do if, mid-flight, the person meant to protect your dignity became the one to tear it away? Imagine sitting with your child on a crowded airplane, his small hands clutching his favorite toy, when a flight attendant suddenly shoves him aside, dismissing his tears as an inconvenience. Now, imagine you are not just any father. You're the man who owns the very airline that promised safety, respect, and care. Tonight's story unfolds thousands of feet in the air, where silence is heavy, and every eye becomes a witness. A father's quiet strength collides with arrogance in uniform. A child's innocent question, "Can people really change?" shakes the hearts of everyone on board. And when the truth finally lands, it doesn't just challenge one crew member, it threatens to expose the soul of an entire company. Will justice come in the form of punishment? Or will it emerge in the fragile echo of redemption? And most importantly, what lesson will a young boy carry for the rest of his life? Stay with us as we reveal this powerful story. And before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you'll never miss the stories that change the way we see the world. The hum of the engines filled the cabin like a steady heartbeat, the kind that passengers learned to ignore after the first half hour in the air. For most people, a flight was just a pause between destinations, a few hours suspended in the sky. But for Jonathan Hayes, sitting in seat 3A of United Skies, Flight 1847, this flight carried a different weight. Beside him, his 9-year-old son Ethan leaned against the window, his small hands pressed flat against the glass as if trying to hold on to the clouds rushing past. Ethan had always loved flying. Planes weren't just machines to him, they were miracles. To Jonathan, watching his son's wide-eyed wonder had always been the purest part of their journeys together. But today, there was a tension in the air, something beneath the surface, a subtle sharpness that Jonathan, with his years of experience both as a father and as the CEO of the very airline carrying them, could sense like a pilot senses turbulence before the first jolt. The flight had been smooth until then. Passengers had settled into their routines, some reading, some dozing, some scrolling endlessly through glowing screens. The flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, trays of drinks gliding up and down the aisle. At first glance, it was just another ordinary flight. And then, the moment came. It began with something so small, so ordinary, that most people might have overlooked it. Ethan's apple juice tipped over on his tray table, splashing onto his shirt. He gasped softly, startled more than upset, fumbling with the napkin his father handed him. Jonathan was about to help when a shadow fell over them. "Can you control your kid?" The words landed like a slap. Jonathan turned to see Samantha Cole, the senior flight attendant, standing rigid in the aisle. Her eyes were sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked not at Jonathan, not at him as a paying passenger, but at Ethan, as if the boy's small accident was an unforgivable crime. He spilled his drink, Jonathan said calmly, keeping his voice level. He had been in boardrooms where tempers flared hotter than jet fuel. He knew how to stay steady. It was an accident. We'll clean it up. But Samantha's tone hardened, carrying across the rows of first class where silence had suddenly spread like wildfire. "This is first class, sir. We expect a certain level of decorum." Jonathan felt Ethan shrink beside him, the boy's shoulders hunched, his head lowering as if he were somehow guilty. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He placed a hand gently on his son's back, a silent reassurance. I understand your expectations, Jonathan replied evenly, but he's 9 years old. Accidents happen. I'll take care of it. Yet Samantha didn't move on. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice sharp enough for others nearby to hear. If you can't manage him, maybe you shouldn't be seated here. The words cut deeper than any turbulence could. For Ethan, it was humiliation, delivered in front of strangers. For Jonathan, it was a trigger, the unmistakable sting of judgment, not just at a spilled drink, but at something unspoken, something darker in the undertone of her voice. Before Jonathan could respond, another voice rose from 2 rows back. "Excuse me," said Helen Carter, a silver-haired woman with kind eyes who had been quietly reading her novel until now. "I don't think that was necessary." Heads turned. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Samantha stiffened. Her authority challenged. "Ma'am, please stay out of this." But Helen didn't flinch. "He's a child, and he's already embarrassed enough. You don't need to make it worse." Jonathan felt gratitude flicker in his chest, but his focus remained on Ethan, whose cheeks burned red. The boy tried to mumble an apology, but Jonathan squeezed his shoulder gently. "You don't need to apologize for being human," Jonathan whispered to him. The tension in the air was heavy now, thick enough that even the hum of the engines seemed distant. Passengers exchanged glances, whispers beginning to ripple through the rows. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared, curiosity piqued by the drama unfolding in what should have been a peaceful flight. Samantha straightened, her expression hard. "Sir, if you have an issue, you can file a complaint after landing. Right now, I'm asking you to keep your child under control." Jonathan inhaled slowly, the way he had taught himself to do in the years since losing his wife. Deep, steady breaths to hold back the storm. He could have told her right then who he was, that he wasn't just a passenger in seat 3A, but the man who owned the airline, the man whose policy she was supposed to represent. But he didn't. Not yet. Because this moment wasn't about power. It wasn't about authority. It was about Ethan. About teaching his son what strength looked like, even under fire. Jonathan leaned back slightly, his voice calm but firm. "My son is fine. The situation is under control. Please continue your duties." For a brief second, Samantha seemed caught off guard. She opened her mouth as if to retort, but then snapped it shut. With a sharp turn, she strode down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. Silence lingered, broken only by the soft rustle of Helen Carter's pages as she returned to her book. Her presence a quiet shield of solidarity. Ethan stared at his juice-stained shirt, his small fingers twisting at the fabric. "Dad," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Did I do something wrong?" Jonathan's heart clenched. He pulled his son close, lowering his voice so only Ethan could hear. "No, Ethan, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes people see what they want to see, not what's really there. And that's their problem, not yours." Ethan looked up, his eyes uncertain, but everyone was staring. Yes, Jonathan admitted softly, they were. But sometimes, standing tall means being seen, even when it's uncomfortable. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his small body leaning into his father's side. Outside the window, the endless stretch of clouds rolled on, oblivious to the storm that had passed through the cabin. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, a flicker of anger breaking through his calm. He had built United Skies to be different, to be better, to be humane, and yet Here, in the cabin of his own airline, his son had been made to feel small, less than. The sky outside was bright and endless, but inside Jonathan Hayes, something had cracked open. It wasn't just about a spilled drink. It wasn't just about one flight attendant's words. It was about something far larger, something that had followed him his entire life, now threatening to take root in his sons. As the plane cruised steadily toward its destination, Jonathan knew this incident was only the beginning. The sky above might look calm, but real turbulence was coming. The day before the flight had been quiet, too quiet, almost, for the Hayes household in Austin, Texas. The morning light spilled gently across the wooden floors of their suburban home. The house was modern, but not ostentatious, built for comfort rather than show. A wide porch faced the street, and in the backyard, an old oak tree stretched its branches like arms trying to touch the sky. For years, that tree had been Ethan's kingdom. He had climbed it, swung from its ropes, hidden behind it during games of make-believe. Now, at 9 years old, Ethan had begun to outgrow such simple play. He had his books, his sketches, his fascination with airplanes, but every so often, Jonathan would catch him gazing at that tree, torn between boyhood and something just beyond it. Jonathan sat at the dining table, his laptop open but idle, the glow of unread emails reflecting off his glasses. The demands of United Skies waited impatiently inside that inbox board reports, financial statements, policy drafts. But today, he wasn't just a CEO, he was a father preparing his son for a trip, and that role came first. Dad Ethan's voice echoed from upstairs. "Yeah, buddy, do I pack the blue hoodie or the gray one?" Jonathan smiled faintly. The simplest questions were often the most grounding. Take both. Planes get cold. You'll want options. Ethan appeared moments later, dragging a half-zipped suitcase behind him. His hair was messy, sticking up in the back from the way he'd been lying on the floor earlier, drawing sketches of jets in a notebook. He always drew the wings longer than they were in real life, as though every plane should have the power to reach farther, fly higher. "Do you think it'll be a big plane?" Ethan asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "It's a transcontinental flight," Jonathan replied, watching him with quiet amusement. "So yes, a Dreamliner, brand new, actually." Ethan grinned. With the windows that tint, Jonathan nodded. "That's the one." It was moments like these, small bursts of excitement over little details, that reminded Jonathan what mattered. Not the endless meetings, not the stock market reports, not the politics of running an airline. It was the joy in his son's voice when he talked about the sky. Still, behind that joy, there was a shadow. The house had felt different since Emily, wife, mother, anchor of their family, had passed 2 years ago. The illness had come quickly, stealing her breath before either of them had time to fully understand what was happening. Jonathan had buried his grief in work, in building United Skies into a beacon of what air travel could be. But grief never really left. It lingered in the quiet spaces, in the echoes of laughter that no longer filled the rooms. For Ethan, the loss had been harder to name. Sometimes, he asked about his mom as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Other times, he went silent, locking away the ache in a child's attempt at bravery. Jonathan did his best, but he often wondered if it was enough. Later that afternoon, Jonathan folded shirts with precise, methodical hands. He had always been a man of order, believing that details creased collars, polished shoes spoke louder than words. Yet, as he tucked clothes neatly into Ethan's suitcase, he felt the weight of contradiction. In business, he had control. At home, with his son's grief, with his own control was an illusion. "Dad," Ethan said softly, appearing in the doorway with his stuffed bear tucked under one arm. It was the same bear he'd carried to the hospital during Emily's last weeks, worn now but deeply loved. "Do you think Mom would like flying on the Dreamliner?" Jonathan froze for a moment, the shirt in his hands forgotten. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. "She loved flying. Remember how she used to watch the planes with you?" Ethan nodded, clutching the bear tighter. "She said planes were like magic, like stories that take you somewhere new." Jonathan swallowed hard. He forced a smile, crouching to meet his son's eyes. She was right. And tomorrow, we'll be part of that magic. Together. The boy's face softened, a small flicker of comfort breaking through the sadness. They spent the evening cooking dinner, simple pasta with garlic bread. Ethan insisted on grating the cheese himself, leaving half of it scattered across the counter. Jonathan didn't correct him. Instead, he let the boy chatter about the airport, the jet engines, the possibility of turbulence. Jonathan answered every question patiently, with the kind of depth he reserved only for Ethan. When bedtime came, Jonathan tucked Ethan in, the bear nestled against his chest. The boy's eyelids fluttered, heavy with sleep, but his voice lingered. "Dad." "Yes, buddy. When you're up there, when you're running the company, do you ever feel like you forget about me?" The question pierced deeper than Jonathan expected. He sat on the edge of the bed, the lamplight casting soft shadows across Ethan's face. "I never forget about you," Jonathan said firmly, though his voice trembled. "You're the reason I do all of this. Every late night, every meeting, it's all for you. But I know sometimes it feels like I'm far away." Ethan's eyes were half closed, his voice a whisper. "I just don't want to lose you too." Jonathan's chest tightened. He reached out, brushing the boy's hair back gently. "You won't. I promise." The promise was heavier than any contract he had ever signed. When Ethan drifted into sleep, Jonathan lingered a while longer, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. In the silence of the room, the memories of Emily returned, her laughter, her warmth, her final plea to him before the illness took her, be there for him. "John, don't just provide, be there." He had vowed to honor those words, yet too often, he wondered if he had failed. Running an airline demanded everything, and sometimes it stole the best parts of him before he could give them to his son. That night, Jonathan stood by the window, staring at the quiet street below. The hum of cicadas filled the air, steady and relentless. He thought about the flight ahead, about Ethan's excitement, about the innocence that still shone through the cracks of loss. And he thought about the burden he carried, the dual identity of father and CEO. It was a balance he never seemed to master, a scale that tipped too easily, leaving him questioning whether he was strong enough to carry both roles. Tomorrow, he told himself, would be simple, just a father and son, side by side, journeying together across the sky. But beneath that fragile hope, a storm waited. The next day, in the cabin of Flight 1847, that storm would break. Airports had a rhythm of their own. The rolling suitcases, the hurried footsteps, the calls for final boarding. It was a symphony of movement that most travelers ignored in their rush to get somewhere else. But for Ethan Hayes, every sound was part of the adventure. His small hand clutched tightly to his father's as they walked through Austin Bergstrom International Airport. The boy's eyes darted from gate signs to the windows where planes sat waiting, their tails lined up like soldiers. "Dad, look, that's a 737 right, and that one that's bigger. Is that the Dreamliner?" Jonathan followed his son's gaze, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're right on the first one. The second, that's our plane." Ethan's mouth fell open. "It's huge, big enough to cross the country," Jonathan said. The boy stared in awe, pressing his face to the glass as if the wide body of the jet itself was a marvel of magic. And for him, it was. Every detail, from the curve of the wings to the engines that looked like yawning mouths, seemed alive. Jonathan stood a step behind, watching. He admired that Ethan could still see wonder where others saw only routine. The truth was, Jonathan himself had once felt the same. Years ago, before meetings, profit margins, and responsibility weighed him down. He had looked at planes with the same awe, but not everyone walking through the airport carried that sense of wonder. At the boarding gate, the line was already forming families juggling strollers, businessmen checking their watches, couples whispering in hushed tones. The gate agent scanned tickets briskly, her smile professional but tired. Travel brought out the best and worst in people. Among those boarding the same flight was Samantha Cole. She stood at the edge of the gate area, adjusting her uniform with clipped motions. Her hair was perfectly neat, her lipstick precise, but her eyes carried a heaviness that makeup couldn't disguise. She glanced around at the passengers, not seeing them as individuals but as tasks, faces to be managed, complaints to be silenced, demands to be met. The night before, she'd barely slept. Divorce papers sat unsigned on her kitchen counter. Her rent was due, and the job she once loved now felt like a cage. The smile she wore nothing more than armor. She had told herself that professionalism meant detachment, that efficiency meant not caring. But under the surface, her frustration was building, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. Jonathan and Ethan stepped forward when their group was called. The gate agent smiled, scanning their tickets. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Hayes." Jonathan nodded, offering a polite smile in return. They walked the jet bridge, the tunnel vibrating faintly with the sound of engines preparing. Ethan bounced slightly with each step, his excitement barely contained. "Dad, do you think the pilots will let me see the cockpit?" "Maybe," Jonathan said, ruffling his hair. "We'll ask. No promises." When they entered the cabin, the cool air hit them first filtered, faintly scented with coffee and recycled oxygen. The first-class section stretched ahead, wide seats gleaming in soft light. Some passengers were already seated, tucking laptops into side pockets or buckling themselves in. Ethan's eyes widened. "It's so big, and the seats they recline." "Right," Jonathan smiled. "They do. Go ahead. Try yours." The boy climbed onto his seat, pressing buttons experimentally until the leg rest moved. He laughed, a sound that drew a few curious glances from nearby passengers. Jonathan set their carry-ons neatly into the overhead bin, then sat down beside his son, adjusting his watch almost unconsciously. He looked around, cataloging the small details, the arrangement of magazines, the faint hum of the ventilation system, the way the cabin lights were just a touch too bright. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw Samantha. She moved down the aisle with practiced precision, her steps sharp, her expression unreadable. To most, she was just another flight attendant, efficient, professional, untouchable. But Jonathan had spent decades reading people. He noticed the stiffness in her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed at small inconveniences, the faint sigh she tried to hide when a passenger asked for help with a bag. Ethan noticed her too, though differently. His curious eyes followed her as she arranged service items and checked seat belts. "She looks serious," he whispered. Jonathan leaned close. Some people carry a lot on their shoulders. Sometimes it shows. Ethan frowned, thoughtful beyond his years. "Like you," Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. He studied his son's earnest face before nodding slowly. "Yes, sometimes like me." The passengers continued boarding. A businessman in a pressed suit argued with a flight attendant about overhead space. A young couple snapped selfies, their voices pitched too loud in the quiet cabin. An elderly man shuffled slowly down the aisle, his cane tapping gently against the floor. Each carried their own story, their own burdens and joys, Jonathan wondered. Not for the first time. How many stories were hidden in a single flight? Hundreds of strangers, all crossing paths in a metal tube suspended miles above the earth. Some encounters were fleeting, forgotten before the plane touched down. Others changed lives. For Samantha, the sight of Jonathan and Ethan seated together in first class triggered something she couldn't quite name. She saw the boy's messy hair, his wide eyes, his teddy bear poking out of his backpack. She saw the father composed, polished, clearly successful. And somewhere deep inside, resentment flared. It wasn't about them, not really. It was about everything she had lost, everything she felt denied. But in that moment, Jonathan and Ethan became symbols, targets for the bitterness she carried. As the cabin filled, the intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard United Skies Flight 1847 service to Seattle. Please take your seats as we prepare for departure." The boarding door closed with a heavy thud. Ethan leaned close to his father, whispering, "It feels like we're about to go on an adventure." Jonathan squeezed his son's hand, his gaze steady on the aisle where Samantha moved with clipped precision. "Yes," he said softly, "an adventure." Neither of them knew how true those words would be. Outside, the sky was calm. Inside the cabin, tension had already begun to stir quiet, invisible, like air currents shifting before a storm. Jonathan adjusted his seatbelt. Ethan hugged his bear close. Samantha forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The plane began to push back from the gate. The storm was boarding with them. The plane leveled off smoothly, the skyline of Austin shrinking into a patchwork of green and gray far below. Seatbelt signs dinged softly, releasing passengers into a cocoon of routine trays opening, books unfolding, conversations bubbling. Ethan leaned toward the window, nose nearly pressed against the cool glass. "We're above the clouds. Dad, look, they look like fields of cotton." Jonathan smiled faintly, watching his son's wonder with quiet gratitude. "That's the best part of flying. Up here, everything feels peaceful." But peace was fragile. It never lasted long in enclosed spaces where strangers sat elbow to elbow, nerves strung tight by altitude and fatigue. Samantha Cole moved down the aisle, her service cart rolling smoothly. To most passengers, she appeared professional, precise, untouchable. Yet, beneath the crisp uniform and practiced smile, a storm was brewing. She had already dealt with a quarrel in coach about overhead space, a passenger who complained about the Wi-Fi, and another who wanted a different meal than the one stocked. Each interaction chipped away at the thin shell of patience she had left. When she reached the first-class cabin, her eyes fell again on Jonathan and Ethan. The boy was still marveling at the view, a half-empty cup of apple juice resting precariously on his tray table. Samantha felt something twist in her chest, resentment, sharp and unyielding. To her, it looked like indulgence, a child in first class, while she worked double shifts to cover bills, a man who radiated calm authority, while her own life spun further out of control. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked coolly, stopping at their row. Jonathan shook his head politely. "We're fine, thank you." But Ethan, shy yet curious, spoke up. "Do you have cookies?" Samantha's lips tightened. "We have snacks, yes, but this isn't a playground." The boy blinked, unsure how to respond. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. He just asked a question. If cookies aren't available, a simple no is enough. The cart rattled faintly as Samantha gripped the handle. Something inside her snapped. "Sir, with all respect, children in first class are expected to behave. If he can't manage that..." Maybe her words were sharper than she intended, carrying over the quiet cabin. Passengers turned their heads. The businessman across the aisle smirked faintly, while the young couple 2 rows ahead whispered. Ethan's face flushed crimson. His hands fumbled for the bear sticking out of his backpack, hugging it close like a shield. His lower lip trembled, though he bit it hard to keep from crying. Jonathan's pulse quickened, but his expression stayed calm. Years of boardroom battles had trained him to keep his face steady when provoked. He lowered his voice, quiet enough that only she could hear. "You've crossed a line." Samantha stiffened. "I'm simply enforcing standards." "You're humiliating a child," Jonathan said firmly, his words precise as a scalpel, "and that's unacceptable." For a long second, they locked eyes, hers filled with brittle defiance, his with controlled steel. Around them, the cabin held its breath, and then a voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," said Helen Carter, seated 2 rows back. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of years. "That boy has done nothing wrong. He asked for a cookie. That's hardly misbehavior." All eyes turned toward the elderly woman with silver hair and gentle eyes. Her hands rested lightly on her book, but her gaze was unwavering. "Ma'am, please," Samantha began, but Helen didn't let her finish. "No," she said softly but firmly. "I've watched him since boarding. He's polite, he's quiet, and he's a child. Whatever else you're carrying, don't put it on him." Whispers rippled through the cabin. Some nodded in quiet agreement. Others looked down, unwilling to be involved. Jonathan reached for Ethan's hand under the tray table, squeezing it gently. His son's fingers curled around his, trembling but grateful. Samantha's jaw clenched. She forced a brittle smile. "I'll bring the snacks." She pushed the cart away, her back rigid, her steps sharp, but the damage was done. The tension lingered in the air like static before a storm. Ethan whispered, "Dad, did I do something bad?" Jonathan leaned close, his voice soft but steady. "No, Ethan, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes people lash out because of their own struggles. It's not about you." The boy nodded faintly, though his eyes glistened. He pressed his bear against his chest, trying to make himself small. Jonathan's chest tightened. It wasn't just about this flight. It was about what his son was learning about the world, about dignity, about injustice, and Jonathan knew he had to model strength, not just for the passengers watching, but for Ethan's future. Minutes passed. Drinks were served to others, trays collected. Conversations slowly resumed, though the undercurrent of unease remained. But Jonathan's calm exterior concealed a storm of his own. He thought of Emily, how she would have reacted, how she had always been the fierce protector of their son's innocence. He thought of his role, not just as a father, but as the man behind United Skies, a company built on values of respect and dignity, and he thought of the choice before him to remain silent or to act. For now, he chose silence, not because he was weak, but because the moment wasn't right. Ethan leaned against his arm, eyes heavy with exhaustion from the emotional blow. Jonathan wrapped an arm around him, steady as a fortress. In the row behind, Helen Carter closed her book, her gaze drifting toward the boy. She had seen too much in her long life, too many moments when the vulnerable were silenced by the powerful. She would not let this be one of them. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our beverage service. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The words were routine, but nothing about the cabin felt routine anymore. Jonathan stared out the window. The clouds below looked peaceful, endless, but inside the plane, the turbulence was human, and it had only just begun. As Samantha moved down the aisle again, her expression hardened. She told herself she was justified, that discipline was necessary, but deep down, a sliver of doubt pierced through her anger. A child's tears, an old woman's words, and a man's steady gaze that refused to yield. The clash wasn't over, it was only beginning, and by the time Flight 1847 touched down, the world would know it. The hum of the engines filled the silence that had stretched across the first-class cabin. On the surface, everything looked ordinary: passengers sipping drinks, a businessman typing furiously on his laptop. The young couple leaning close over shared earbuds. But beneath the calm, tension coiled tight, ready to snap. Ethan sat quietly, his bear clutched against his chest. His wide eyes flicked nervously toward the aisle, where Samantha Cole moved briskly with the beverage cart. He kept his voice low when he leaned toward his father. "Dad, is she still mad at me?" Jonathan Hayes placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "She wasn't mad at you. Ethan, she's angry at something else. You just happened to be nearby when it spilled over." The boy's lips pressed together, unconvinced. The sting of humiliation lingered. Even if Jonathan's words tried to soften it, Jonathan felt it too, the echo of that public rebuke. The way passengers had turned their heads, the way his son had shrunk into himself. It ignited something inside him, a fire banked under years of restraint. But he forced his expression to remain calm. His boardroom battles had taught him that eruptions of anger rarely solved anything. Still, a father's instinct burned hotter than corporate strategy. Across the cabin, Helen Carter observed quietly. Her book remained closed on her lap. She had seen injustice before, in decades that spanned protests, civil rights marches, and the slow grind of progress. This, by comparison, was small, yet small moments often revealed the truth of character. Samantha reached their row again, her tray of drinks balanced neatly. Her smile was practiced, her voice clipped. "Anything else for you two?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We're fine, but Ethan, despite his nerves, whispered, "Could I have water, please, for a moment?" Samantha's expression flickered annoyance, flashing across her eyes before she quickly masked it. She poured the water with efficient movements, placing the cup on Ethan's tray with a little more force than necessary. "Thank you," Ethan said softly. She moved on without acknowledgement. Jonathan exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to remain still in his lap. He couldn't explode here, not with Ethan watching, not in front of strangers, but the line between patience and passivity was razor thin, and he could feel himself walking it. Then it happened. A sudden jolt rippled through the cabin. Light turbulence, nothing unusual. Drinks wobbled in cups, trays rattled faintly. But Ethan, startled, tipped his water accidentally. The cup tumbled, spilling across the tray table, splashing onto his clothes and dripping down toward the carpet. The boy gasped, fumbling to catch it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean Samantha was on him instantly. This is exactly what I was talking about." Her voice rose, sharp, carrying through the cabin. "Children in first class need to behave. If you can't control yourself, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." Her words struck like a slap. The businessman across the aisle raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained by the spectacle. The couple in front fell silent, glancing at each other uneasily. Ethan froze, cheeks burning crimson, tears springing to his eyes. He clutched his bear tightly, his voice breaking. "I said I was sorry." Jonathan stood, slowly, deliberately. He rose from his seat, towering over Samantha. His voice, though low, cut through the air with precision. "That's enough." The cabin hushed instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned to the confrontation. Samantha blinked, taken aback by the sudden authority in his tone. "Sir, please sit down. You're causing a disturbance." Jonathan's gaze locked on hers, unflinching. "You humiliated my son once. I let it go, but you will not do it again." The intercom dinged softly, as if even the plane itself acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Sir Samantha began, but Jonathan cut her off, his voice even but steely. "You're targeting a child for something as small as spilled water. That's not discipline, that's cruelty, and I won't allow it." For a second, her composure cracked. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not in front of a cabin full of passengers. Her hand trembled slightly on the cart handle, though she quickly masked it with a scoff. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job. And you don't get to take your frustrations out on a 9-year-old boy," Jonathan said, each word deliberate, measured, immovable. The silence that followed was electric. Then Helen Carter's voice rang out once more, calm but resolute. "He's right," she said, her eyes fixed on Samantha. "You've crossed a line. Twice." Other murmurs followed. A man in the back muttered, "Yeah, she's out of line." The couple in front nodded faintly. The businessman across the aisle smirked, sensing drama but not daring to comment aloud. Samantha felt the ground shift beneath her. The authority she clung to was slipping, unraveling in front of witnesses. Panic mingled with anger, feeding her defensiveness. "Everyone, please," she said quickly, her voice louder now, brittle at the edges. "Return to your business. There's nothing to see here." But there was everything to see. Jonathan's steady posture, Ethan's trembling frame, Helen's unwavering gaze. These images carved themselves into the memory of everyone present. Ethan whispered up at his father, voice small but pleading. "Can we just stop?" Please, Jonathan looked down at him, his heart aching. He wanted to shield him, to remove him from this suffocating moment. But more than that, he wanted Ethan to see that dignity was worth defending. He softened his expression, crouching slightly to meet his son's eyes. "You've done nothing wrong, Ethan, nothing." The boy nodded faintly, tears slipping free despite his efforts to hold them back. Jonathan rose again, his voice directed not just at Samantha but at the cabin. "Respect is not optional," he said quietly, but firmly. "Not in this company, not in this world, and certainly not toward a child." Passengers exchanged glances. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded subtly, as though acknowledging a truth they had long felt but rarely spoken. Samantha's chest heaved. Her carefully constructed shell had cracked wide open. She wanted to scream, to assert control, to remind them all that she was the authority here. But deep inside, something else stirred a sliver of shame, a recognition she couldn't bear to face. The captain's voice broke the tension over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some light turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The message was routine, but in the cabin, turbulence already roared human, emotional, unstoppable. Jonathan sat again, wrapping an arm around Ethan's shoulders. His son leaned into him, small and fragile, but stronger than he knew. Samantha pushed the cart forward, her steps stiff, her hands trembling. Her mind raced with 1,000 defenses, excuses, justifications. But, no matter how she spun it, the truth had been spoken aloud. The boy had spilled water, she had spilled cruelty, and the entire cabin had seen it. As the plane hummed steadily through the sky, the battle lines were drawn. The breaking point had been reached. Nothing about this flight would ever be ordinary again. The hum of the engines was steady, but the air inside the cabin was anything but calm. What had begun as a single sharp exchange now radiated like ripples across water, reaching every row, every set of eyes and ears. Jonathan Hayes sat tall in his seat, one arm wrapped protectively around Ethan, who clutched his bear against his chest. The boy's eyes were red, cheeks damp, but he sat upright now, as if trying to mimic his father's quiet strength. Across the aisle, Samantha Cole rolled the beverage cart toward the galley with rigid motions, her lips pressed tight, her knuckles white on the handle. She could feel the passengers' stares prickling against her back, judging, dissecting, condemning. She told herself she was only doing her job, maintaining order, enforcing standards. But the whispering voices around her told another story. "Did you see how she snapped at him?" a woman muttered softly to her seatmate. "He's just a kid," another voice replied. "I'd never let anyone speak to my child like that," came a third. Each hushed comment was a pebble added to the weight pressing down on Samantha's chest. Helen Carter finally broke the tension. Her voice, calm but firm, carried clearly through the cabin. "This isn't about spilled water, it's about dignity. We all know it." A murmur of agreement rippled. Some nodded subtly, others whispered, but the collective energy shifted. The cabin was no longer neutral ground. Jonathan felt it. The passengers' eyes weren't just watching, now they were choosing sides. He hadn't intended to spark a revolt, but revolts often began not with speeches, but with a single injustice witnessed too many times. Samantha turned sharply, her voice brittle. "Everyone, please remain seated. This discussion is over." But her words rang hollow. The authority in her tone was fraying, unraveling with every second she failed to control the narrative. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke up, his voice tinged with irritation. Maybe if you focused on service instead of lectures, we wouldn't be wasting time. Laughter bubbled from somewhere in the back. Not loud, but enough. Samantha's face flushed. Her uniform, once a shield, now felt like a costume she couldn't shed. She snapped back, "Sir, I suggest you mind your own business." That did it. Passengers leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The young couple 2 rows ahead turned in their seats, the woman's voice rising. She humiliated a child. That's everyone's business. The man beside her nodded. We all saw it. Ethan's grip on Jonathan's arm tightened. His small voice trembled. "Dad, are they angry at her?" Jonathan leaned down, whispering softly. "They're angry at what she did, not at you." The boy nodded faintly, though confusion still clouded his eyes. In the aisle, Samantha felt her control slipping through her fingers like sand. Panic surged. She wasn't just fighting a father, now she was fighting a cabin full of witnesses, each word fueling the fire. Her thoughts spiraled. If she lost control here, what would happen when they landed a report, a complaint, suspension, termination? The thought of losing everything, her job, her stability, the last shred of order in her life, twisted her fear into fury. She raised her voice, sharp and commanding. "Everyone, that's enough. If you continue to disrupt this flight, I'll have security waiting when we land." The threat backfired instantly. Passengers straightened, eyes narrowing. The businessman smirked. The young couple glared. Helen Carter shook her head slowly, disappointment etched in every line of her face. Jonathan stood once more, his voice calm but ringing with authority. "Intimidation won't fix this. Respect will. Silence. Pure, unbroken silence." His words cut deeper than shouting ever could. Ethan looked up at him, wide-eyed. His father's presence was steady, immovable, like an anchor in the storm. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, her anger faltered. His words echoed in her mind, colliding with the doubts she had tried to bury. Respect, the one thing she had demanded but failed to give. But pride clawed its way back. She forced her voice steady, though it shook at the edges. "Sir, please sit down. You're escalating the situation." Jonathan's reply was quiet, deliberate. "No, I'm holding you accountable." The cabin erupted not with shouting, but with murmurs of agreement. Passengers nodded, exchanged glances, whispered words like "finally" and "about time." It was no longer Jonathan versus Samantha. It was the passengers versus injustice. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "They believe you, Dad." Jonathan squeezed his shoulder. "They believe the truth." Helen Carter finally rose, her cane tapping softly against the aisle carpet. Her voice, though gentle, carried immense weight. "We are all passengers here. We place our trust in you, the crew, to keep us safe and respected. But today, that trust has been shaken. This isn't about authority. It's about humanity." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Samantha's throat tightened. For the first time, her vision blurred. She blinked hard, fighting the sting of tears. But the wall she had built for so long, the wall of detachment, of superiority, of anger, was crumbling. Passengers were no longer just customers. They were witnesses, judges, and she, despite the uniform, was the one on trial. The turbulence outside grew stronger, rattling trays and shaking cups. Oxygen masks swayed faintly above their heads. The plane shuddered, a physical reflection of the storm inside the cabin. Ethan pressed against Jonathan, frightened by the sudden jolts. Jonathan wrapped both arms around him, whispering reassurance. "It's all right, son. Just a little rough air." But inside, Jonathan knew the real turbulence wasn't outside the plane. It was here, in this pressurized tube 30,000 feet above the earth. Samantha steadied herself against the cart, her breath ragged. She wanted to scream, to command silence, to demand obedience, but the truth was undeniable. She had lost them. The passengers, the authority, herself. Jonathan's eyes remained steady on hers. He didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He simply held her gaze with quiet, unshakable strength. It was the kind of look that said, "Change now," or be broken by the truth. The revolt wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was stronger than that. It was a collective refusal to accept cruelty as normal. And once such a revolt began, there was no turning back. As the plane rode the turbulence, as the cabin vibrated with whispers and glances, Jonathan Hayes knew this was no longer just a flight. It was a reckoning for Samantha, for the passengers, for his son, watching with wide, searching eyes, and for himself, because sometimes revolutions didn't start in streets or boardrooms. Sometimes they started 30,000 feet in the sky when one man refused to let his son's dignity be trampled, and a cabin full of strangers decided to stand with him. The revolt had begun, and the landing would decide how it ended. Captain William Foster sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls as the plane sliced through a patch of rough air. His co-pilot, First Officer Jenna Morales, adjusted a knob on the overhead panel, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Light chop at 33,000, she said, her voice even. "Feels like more than chop," Foster replied, eyes narrowing at the instruments. He had flown for nearly 3 decades, logging thousands of hours, and he knew turbulence when he felt it. But this vibration felt different, more like the atmosphere itself was unsettled. The radio crackled faintly with air traffic control updates, routine, predictable, but inside his mind, something tugged, a sense that not everything was routine today. A sharp chime broke through his thoughts. The interphone. Jenna reached for it. Flight deck. A tense voice came through the purser. "Captain, we've got a situation in first class." Foster's shoulders tensed. Define situation. It started with a child, spilled drink, a misunderstanding, but it's escalated. The lead attendant's in conflict with a passenger, and now others are getting involved. The whole cabin's on edge. Jenna shot him a glance. Foster's jaw tightened. He had heard these kinds of reports before, but the tone in the purser's voice chilled him. "Is anyone physically threatening?" he asked. "No, not yet. But the tension's bad. You need to know it's unraveling fast." Foster rubbed his temple. 30,000 feet in the air. No one could walk away. Containment was critical. "All right. Keep it from escalating further. I'll assess when I can." He hung up slowly, staring out at the endless horizon. "Damn it," Jenna studied him. "Want me to go back there and observe?" He shook his head. "No. If the cockpit empties, that sends the wrong signal. We stay here, but we may need to act before this flight spirals." Meanwhile, in the cabin, the storm brewed hotter. Jonathan Hayes sat like a fortress beside Ethan, shielding his son from the hostile energy swirling in the aisle. The passengers murmured. their voices rising and falling like waves. Samantha Cole stood stiffly near the galley, her arms crossed, her jaw set. She kept replaying Jonathan's words in her mind. Respect is not optional. The phrase gnawed at her, colliding with the passenger's accusing stares. She wanted to push it away, but it dug deeper. Helen Carter rose again, leaning on her cane, her voice deliberate. Captain needs to be informed. This can't be left hanging in midair. Her words were met with nods, small affirmations. The revolt had become an open demand. Samantha's stomach clenched. If the captain became involved, her mistakes would be laid bare, and Jonathan would have the stage to finish dismantling her authority. She tried one last grasp at control. Everyone sit down. This flight is under my authority. But her voice cracked, and in that crack the passengers heard the truth. Authority had slipped from her hands. Jonathan stood, calm but firm. Call the captain. Now. The cabin quieted. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an expectation. Samantha hesitated, then turned toward the interphone. Her hand hovered, trembling. Pride screamed at her not to press it, but fear pressed harder. She lifted the receiver with rigid fingers. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened. Captain Foster stepped into the cabin, his uniform crisp, his expression steady. His presence carried the weight of decades in the sky, measured, commanding, impossible to ignore. The passengers' murmurs faded instantly. Even Samantha straightened, forcing her trembling hands behind her back. Foster's eyes scanned the cabin, lingering briefly on Jonathan, then on Ethan's small, tear-stained face. Finally, his gaze settled on Samantha. "Report," he said simply. Samantha swallowed hard. "Minor disruption. Captain, a misunderstanding over passenger conduct." Jonathan's calm voice cut through before she could continue. "With respect. Captain, that's not accurate." The words weren't loud, but they were unshakable. Foster turned to him. "Sir, identify yourself." Jonathan met his eyes. "Jonathan Hayes. My son was singled out, humiliated, and targeted twice. Other passengers witnessed it. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's mistreatment." Gasps whispered through the cabin. Some passengers murmured affirmations. "That's true. We saw it." Helen Carter's voice followed, steady as stone, every word. "The child asked for cookies. Then he spilled water during turbulence. That was all. The treatment he received was cruel." Foster's gaze shifted back to Samantha. "Is that correct?" Her throat closed. She wanted to deny it, to twist the truth into something manageable. But with a dozen witnesses staring, silence became its own confession. Jonathan added softly, "This is not just about my son. It's about respect for every passenger here." Ethan pressed closer into his father's side, his eyes wide. He didn't fully grasp the gravity, but he felt the weight of the moment. The captain exhaled slowly. He was a man who believed in discipline, in hierarchy, in chain of command, but he also believed in truth. And truth, he realized, was staring back at him in the eyes of a frightened child. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice low but clear. "Your concerns are acknowledged." He turned to Samantha. "You and I will discuss this further after landing." Samantha's composure cracked. A flicker of fear crossed her eyes, followed by shame so sharp it stole her breath. She nodded stiffly, words failing her. Foster then addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you your dignity and safety are my highest priority. I expect calm from all of you as we continue this flight. There will be no further incidents." The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Passengers nodded, murmuring their acceptance. The storm eased slightly, but the air still vibrated with tension. Jonathan sat again, his hand resting lightly on Ethan's shoulder. The boy looked up at him with a mix of awe and relief. "Dad," he whispered, "you weren't even scared." Jonathan smiled faintly, though inside his chest still thundered. "Courage doesn't mean no fear, son. It means doing what's right, even when you're afraid." Ethan clutched his bear tighter, his small shoulders relaxing just a little. Helen Carter smiled softly from her seat. She had lived long enough to know revolutions didn't always roar, they sometimes whispered, spoken in the quiet strength of ordinary people who refused to bend. Samantha retreated to the galley, her heart pounding. The captain's words echoed in her mind like a verdict waiting to fall. The pride that had once shielded her now felt hollow, brittle, useless. For the first time in years, she asked herself, when did I stop seeing people as people? When did I forget that respect is the very core of this job? The turbulence outside eased, but the storm inside her remained, in the cockpit. Foster closed the door behind him, his expression grave. He knew this flight wasn't over. The skies ahead might be smooth, but the landing would decide the fate of everyone involved, especially Samantha Cole and Jonathan Hayes, because the name Hayes carried weight, though no one yet in that cabin knew just how much. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, like a battlefield after the first shots are fired. The tension hadn't vanished, it had only sunk deeper, lying under the surface, waiting for the next spark. Jonathan Hayes sat beside his son, Ethan, who had finally stopped trembling. The boy still clutched his bear tightly, his small fingers wrapped around it like an anchor. Jonathan stroked his hair, whispering words only his son could hear, soft reassurances that steadied them both. Across the aisle, Samantha Cole remained in the galley, her uniform crisp but her composure shattered. Every clink of glassware, every hushed murmur from the passengers felt like a judgment ringing in her ears. She had devoted years to this career, enduring sleepless nights, aching feet, and countless flights. Yet here she stood, her authority unraveling in front of strangers and because of one man who refused to bow to her. Captain Foster's words still echoed. "You and I will discuss this further after landing." She closed her eyes briefly, pressing her palms against the counter. For the first time in years, shame outweighed pride, but shame was soon replaced by curiosity. Who exactly was Jonathan Hayes? He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't cursed, hadn't even insulted her. Yet he had dismantled her control with nothing more than calm words and a steady gaze. His presence carried a weight she couldn't define. Passengers whispered too. The businessman leaned over to the young couple. The way he spoke to her, did you hear it? Like a man used to giving orders. "Yeah," the woman replied, not like a regular passenger. Helen Carter, quiet in her seat, studied Jonathan with sharp eyes. She had lived long enough to recognize power when she saw it, not the kind flaunted in loud voices and arrogance, but the quiet kind, rooted in confidence and principle. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why did everyone listen to you?" Even the captain, Jonathan, smiled faintly, because sometimes the truth carries more weight than rank. "Son." But Ethan tilted his head, not satisfied. "No, it's more than that. You talk different, like like people are supposed to listen. Jonathan chuckled softly, brushing a hand over his son's hair. Maybe I've just been in too many rooms where listening mattered. The boy frowned. He was too young to know the full truth, but his instincts were sharp. Then, as if fate itself willed the reveal, the businessman spoke louder, addressing Jonathan directly. "Excuse me," he said, leaning across the aisle. "Forgive me for asking, but you're not an ordinary passenger, are you?" All eyes shifted again. Jonathan looked up slowly, his gaze steady but unreadable. "I'm just a father traveling with his son," he replied. The businessman smirked. "Sure, but fathers don't usually talk like boardroom generals. Who are you really?" The question lingered in the cabin air, thick and unavoidable. Passengers straightened, curiosity sparking like static. Even Samantha, from the galley, froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing. Jonathan exhaled, long and quiet. He hadn't wanted it to come to this. He had hoped to keep his identity private, to let Ethan experience the world without the shadow of a powerful name, but perhaps the moment demanded honesty. "I am Jonathan Hayes," he said softly, yet his words carried across the cabin. "CEO of United Skies Airlines." The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the rows. The young couple's jaws dropped. The businessman's smirk vanished. Passengers whispered furiously, heads turning, eyes widening. Ethan blinked, confused. "Dad, you told me not to tell people." Jonathan smiled gently at him. "Sometimes, son, the truth needs to be told." Samantha's heart slammed against her ribs. CEO, the man she had belittled, the child she had humiliated, belonged to the very top of the company that paid her salary. Her face drained of color. Helen Carter's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "I suspected as much," she murmured. The businessman stammered, his confidence evaporating. You're him, Hayes, the Hayes who restructured the airline. The one on the news last year." Jonathan inclined his head, neither boastful nor apologetic. "I am." Silence stretched, thick with realization. For Samantha, the world tilted on its axis. The power dynamic she had clung to shattered completely. No longer was she a flight attendant chastising a difficult passenger. She was a subordinate who had publicly humiliated the son of her employer, the man whose decisions shaped every flight, every paycheck, every uniform. Her throat burned, words lodging uselessly. Apologies crowded her mind, but none dared pass her lips. Jonathan's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of judgment. "I didn't come here to remind anyone of titles. I came here to travel with my son, like any father would. But perhaps it takes a title for people to remember what respect should look like." Ethan looked up at him, eyes wide. "So they know now that you're the boss." Jonathan chuckled softly. "Boss isn't the right word. Responsibility is, and with responsibility comes the duty to make sure dignity is never optional." Passengers murmured again, this time with admiration. The young woman leaned to her partner. "He didn't even brag. He just said it straight." Helen Carter nodded approvingly. "Power used properly humbles, not humiliates." Samantha could no longer stand still. Her knees trembled. She wanted to shrink into the galley, disappear, erase the entire flight. Instead, she forced herself forward, though each step felt like walking through fire. She stopped before Jonathan, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Hayes, I." But Jonathan held up a hand. His gaze wasn't cruel, but neither was it forgiving, at least. "Not yet. This isn't about me, Ms. Cole. It's about him." He nodded toward Ethan, whose small hands clutched his bear. "You didn't see a child. You saw a nuisance, and that failure is larger than spilled water or cookies. It's about forgetting the humanity in the very people you serve." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to defend, but the words dissolved into ash. Because he was right. Ethan whispered into his father's arm. "Dad, does she have to lose her job?" Jonathan looked down, touched by the innocence in his son's question. He stroked Ethan's hair. "That's not for you to worry about, son. What matters is we learn from mistakes, not repeat them." The boy nodded, his small heart already grappling with mercy. Samantha's eyes burned. A child's compassion shamed her more than the CEO's authority ever could. Captain Foster reappeared from the cockpit, his gaze scanning the faces in the cabin. "I've been updated," he said, his voice steady. "We'll ensure proper follow-up once we land." For now, everyone remained calm. But calm was no longer the right word. The passengers weren't just calm, they were united, bonded by what they had witnessed. Jonathan Hayes had revealed himself, not as a powerful executive, but as a father who demanded dignity for his child, and that, more than his title, had earned their respect. Samantha returned to the galley, her chest heaving, her thoughts in chaos. She had crossed the wrong man at the worst time. But more than that, she had crossed the line of humanity itself, and now, under the scrutiny of her peers, her captain, and the very man who could decide her fate, she had to face the truth. Change wasn't optional anymore. As the engines droned on, carrying them closer to their destination, the truth hung heavy in the air. The CEO had spoken, the father had defended, and the entire cabin would never forget the moment dignity took flight. The engines hummed their steady song, but inside the cabin the silence was sharper than turbulence. Every passenger had absorbed the revelation, and though conversations had quieted, thoughts churned beneath the hush. Jonathan Hayes leaned back in his seat, his arm protectively around Ethan. The boy's head rested against his father's shoulder, eyes half closed but mind far from sleep. Jonathan stared out the small oval window, his own reflection faint against the canvas of endless sky. He had not wanted the truth revealed, not like this. He had promised himself years ago that Ethan would grow up with as normal a life as possible, shielded from the shadow of titles, corporate wars, and constant scrutiny, yet here it was again, his name, spoken aloud, shifting the atmosphere of the cabin. He wondered if Ethan would now carry the same burden Jonathan himself had carried as a young boy, the weight of being recognized not for who you were, but for what your family represented. His chest tightened. Was I selfish to reveal it, or was it necessary? He turned the question over like a stone in his hand, feeling its edges cut deeper with every thought. Beside him, Ethan stirred. "Dad, yes, son. Do people look at us different? Now?" Jonathan hesitated. "Some might." Ethan's brow furrowed. "I don't like it. I just want to be me." Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, the boy's words piercing like an arrow. He squeezed his son's hand. "And you are. Always remember. Ethan, you're not defined by my name. You're defined by your heart." The boy nodded faintly, but Jonathan saw the conflict still alive in his young eyes. The storm within his son had begun early, and Jonathan hated himself for being the one who triggered it. Across the aisle, Samantha Cole sat on the small jump seat near the galley. Her posture collapsed, her hands twisted in her lap, nails digging into her palms. Her thoughts came in waves: shame, regret, anger, fear. How could I have been so blind? She replayed every word she had spoken to Ethan, every sharp gesture, every dismissive tone. The image of the boy's tearful eyes burned her conscience. She wanted to justify herself: stress, turbulence, long hours, a life of personal disappointments that bled into her work. But none of that excused the cruelty she had shown. And now she knew the boy's father wasn't just any passenger. He was the man who could end her career with a single phone call. Her pride whispered, "He'll fire you." Your years of service, gone in minutes, but a different voice, quieter, deeper, rose in her chest. What if this is your chance to change? What if the humiliation you feel now is the wake-up call you've avoided for years? She pressed a hand to her mouth, swallowing back the sudden sting of tears. She hadn't cried in a long time. Not at her father's funeral, not at the end of her marriage, not even during the nights when loneliness pressed hardest. But now, on a plane full of strangers, shame had finally broken the dam. She pulled herself up, walking to the restroom to compose herself. In the mirror's harsh light, her face looked older, wearier, the makeup failing to hide the cracks. "Who are you becoming?" she whispered. The reflection had no answer. Meanwhile, passengers murmured in soft clusters. The businessman leaned toward Helen Carter, his earlier arrogance gone. I judged him wrong, thought he was just another entitled passenger. Helen's eyes stayed on Jonathan, her tone gentle but firm. The mark of true power is restraint. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flaunt his title. He defended his child as any father should, and in doing so, he defended all of us. Her words hung heavy, resonating beyond their small circle. Jonathan overheard, but he didn't acknowledge it. Praise was no comfort to him now. His storm was different, born of guilt. He worried not about his authority, but about the scars his son might carry. He thought of his late wife, Ethan's mother. She had always been better at shielding their child from the weight of his position. She had a way of softening edges, of turning harsh realities into lessons wrapped in love. Jonathan often wondered if he had the same capacity. Would she have handled this better? He asked himself silently. Ethan shifted again. "Dad, do you think she hates me?" His voice was so soft, Jonathan almost missed it. Jonathan blinked. "Who? Son? The lady? The flat lady?" The question struck him like a blade. He pulled Ethan closer. "No. Son. She doesn't hate you. She made a mistake, a big one. But your worth isn't measured by how someone else treats you. It never is." Ethan's eyes glistened, but it hurt. Jonathan kissed the top of his son's head. "I know. And it's okay to let it hurt, but never let it tell you that you're less than you are." Across the cabin, Samantha returned from the restroom, her face freshly washed. She took a deep breath and approached Jonathan's row, though every step made her chest constrict. Passengers watched closely, their expressions ranging from curiosity to judgment. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice low, trembling. "May I speak with you?" Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable. Ethan tensed beside him, clutching his bear tightly. Samantha knelt slightly, lowering herself to the boy's eye level. "Ethan, I owe you an apology." The boy blinked, surprised. "I was unkind to you," she continued, her voice breaking. "I treated you like you didn't matter, when the truth is you matter more than anything. I forgot the most important part of my job: respect. I'm so sorry." Tears gathered in Ethan's eyes, not from fear this time, but from the shock of hearing the words. He looked at his father, unsure how to respond. Jonathan studied Samantha. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of sincerity and pride swallowed whole. Finally, Jonathan nodded. "Thank you for saying that," Ethan whispered. "It's okay." Samantha's lips trembled. That small mercy from a child cut deeper than any punishment. She bowed her head briefly, then returned to the galley, her steps lighter, but her heart still heavy. The passengers who had watched exchanged looks, some surprised, some softened. Helen Carter smiled faintly. Even the hardest storms can break apart when truth is spoken. Jonathan leaned back, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder. His own storm still raged, but perhaps a new current was forming, a current of healing. Still, questions lingered. Could respect truly be restored after it had been broken so deeply? Could dignity lost ever be fully regained? And when they landed, what consequences would follow for Samantha, for the airline, for Jonathan himself? As the plane glided steadily through calmer skies, the storms within each soul remained unresolved. But one truth had emerged clearer than the clouds outside. Respect was not optional, and the absence of it left scars no uniform, no title, no apology could easily erase. The seatbelt sign chimed overhead, a familiar sound, yet in the cabin it carried a different weight now. The announcement from the cockpit came calmly. The captain's voice measured as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and ensure your belts are fastened." Passengers stirred, stowing away books and adjusting blankets. But the mood was far from ordinary. They weren't just passengers preparing for landing. They were witnesses to a story that had unfolded in the sky, a story none of them would soon forget. Jonathan Hayes rested his head briefly against the seat. The descent had begun outside, but inside his chest the climb was steeper than ever. His thoughts churned, shifting between pride and unease. He had defended his son. He had revealed his truth. But he also knew that once the wheels touched down, ripples would spread across the airline, the press, perhaps even the world. He hadn't wanted Ethan thrust into that spotlight. Yet what choice had there been? Ethan, oblivious to the corporate storms awaiting his father, peered out the window at the sea of clouds beneath. "Dad," he whispered, "are we almost home?" Jonathan looked at him tenderly. Almost son. But the word home tugged at his heart. Would home still feel the same after tonight? Or would their lives be reshaped by the fallout of this one flight across the aisle? Samantha Cole sat stiffly, hands clasped in her lap. Her apology to Ethan still lingered in her chest, both a small relief and a heavier burden. She knew words weren't enough. Apologies were fragile things they could soothe but not erase. Her eyes drifted toward Jonathan, but she couldn't meet his gaze for long. She wondered what awaited her after landing. A meeting with the captain, a suspension notice, termination papers. She had worked flights through thunderstorms and medical emergencies, yet nothing terrified her more than the storm she would face on the ground. For years, she had believed her uniform gave her authority, that passengers needed to bend to her rules. Now she saw how hollow that belief had been. Authority without respect was nothing more than control, and control cracked easily when pressed. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling out his phone as though to distract himself. Though no signal came at this altitude, His thoughts, too, lingered on Jonathan Hayes. He had mocked him at first, but now he felt oddly humbled. What struck him most wasn't the title, but how Jonathan had never once wielded it as a weapon. Helen Carter sat quietly, her cane leaning against her leg, her eyes closed as though in prayer. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they would inherit. Would they grow up in skies ruled by arrogance or skies guarded by dignity? She hoped this flight would echo further than these passengers, that the lessons spoken here would ripple outward like a stone cast into water. The plane dipped gently, and the cabin pressure shifted. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, securing trays, checking belts, their usual routine restored. Yet their glances toward Jonathan carried a subtle unease. They had seen one of their own falter, and now the question hung over them all. Would they be judged as a team for one person's mistakes? Samantha walked the aisle one last time. When she reached Jonathan's row, she paused. Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "Mr. Hayes, Ethan, thank you for your patience." Jonathan's gaze lifted. His eyes were calm, but firm. "Ms. Cole," he replied evenly, "respect isn't patience, it's recognition. Remember that." Her cheeks burned, but she nodded. She carried the sentence with her back to the galley like a stone lodged in her pocket, weighty, inescapable. The hum of descent grew louder. Outside, the glow of the city lights sparkled faintly through the thinning clouds, signaling their approach to Earth. For the passengers, the sight usually brought relief. Tonight, it brought anticipation. What would happen when they landed? Would there be reporters waiting? Would the airline issue statements? Would Samantha walk away in silence, or be escorted under watchful eyes? Ethan pressed his forehead to the glass, eyes widening. "Look, Dad, the lights are like stars, but upside down." Jonathan smiled softly. "Yes, stars on the ground." The boy's innocence eased his storm for a moment, but the father in him knew those stars below were also cameras, offices, and meetings where tonight's story would ignite like wildfire. The captain's voice came again. "Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." Samantha swallowed hard, her hands tightening on the jump seat straps. The final descent always gave her a sense of control. The cabin locked, the procedures clear. But now, her heart beat wildly, not with turbulence, but with the knowledge that her career balanced on the edge of what came next. Helen Carter leaned across the aisle toward Jonathan, her eyes soft but piercing. "Young man," she said, though Jonathan was far from young, "you've carried yourself well. But remember, justice without mercy hardens the world, and mercy without justice weakens it. Balance them both, for your son's sake." Jonathan looked at her, moved. "Thank you," he said simply. Her words, wise and measured, struck deeper than any corporate strategy session ever had. The wheels lowered with a rumble, the mechanical whir echoing faintly through the floor. Passengers adjusted, bracing themselves. Some gripped armrests, others clasped hands together. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He wasn't just descending into an airport. He was descending into confrontation, into headlines, into choices that could shape not just his airline, but the values it projected into the world. Ethan squeezed his hand. "You're not scared, right, Dad?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "Even when I am, I hold steady." The boy nodded, his trust absolute. As the city lights drew nearer, Samantha whispered a quiet prayer she hadn't prayed in years. Give me a chance to make this right, even if it costs me everything." The plane jolted as the wheels kissed the runway, a roar of friction rising, then fading as the engines reversed and slowed. Passengers exhaled collectively, the relief of landing mingled with the weight of what lay ahead. Applause didn't break out this time, as it sometimes did. Instead, silence reigned, a silence thick with expectation. Jonathan opened his eyes. Gazing forward, he knew the hardest part was just beginning. The aircraft slowed to a crawl, taxiing toward the gate, seatbelts unclicked prematurely, passengers leaning into the aisles, hungry for the first glimpse of what awaited beyond the cabin doors. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve once more. "Dad, what happens now?" Jonathan placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Now, son, we face what comes, with honesty, with dignity, always." The boy nodded, though the words were larger than his years. Samantha stared at the closed door ahead, her pulse quickening. For the first time in her long career, she feared not turbulence, not emergencies, but truth itself. The final descent was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The chime sounded again, signaling arrival at the gate. The cabin filled with the usual rustle of passengers collecting bags, the metallic click of buckles, the shuffle of feet. But beneath the ordinary sounds was a current of tension, heavy and unspoken. Jonathan Hayes sat still, his hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, anchoring the boy against the tide of motion. He knew what awaited outside the cabin door. Whispers had already spread among passengers words like CEO, scandal, airline crisis. Once the door opened, the private storm would spill into the public. Ethan looked up at him, eyes wide and searching. "Dad, why is everyone so quiet?" Jonathan gave a faint smile. "Because sometimes silence carries the loudest truths." The boy frowned at the riddle, hugging his bear tighter. At the galley, Samantha Cole stood frozen, her hands clutching the service counter. She had straightened her uniform, smoothed her hair, but nothing could disguise the weight pressing against her chest. She thought of the hundreds of flights she had worked, laughing children, irritable businessmen, frightened first-time flyers. She had prided herself on professionalism, on command. And yet, with one boy and his father, she had stripped herself of the very humanity her job required. She feared the door would open to supervisors, perhaps even security. She feared the words, "You're finished." But most of all, she feared the look in Jonathan's eyes, calm, unwavering, and merciless in their truth. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the gate. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is switched off." The click of the sign extinguishing was like a gunshot starting a race. Passengers leapt to their feet, opening overhead bins with hurried movements. But even then, eyes drifted toward Jonathan and his son, like magnets drawn to the center of gravity in the room. The businessman lingered nearby, his suitcase handle clutched tightly. "Mr. Hayes," he said cautiously, I want to apologize. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved either. I judged too quickly." Jonathan looked up, his expression steady. "Respect isn't for me alone. It's for every passenger who boards. Remember that." The businessman swallowed hard, nodding. His arrogance from earlier seemed to have evaporated. Helen Carter struggled to stand, leaning on her cane. Jonathan immediately rose, offering his hand to steady her. She smiled at him, her gaze warm. "You'll carry this story far beyond these walls," she said softly. Make sure it shapes more than headlines. Let it shape hearts. Jonathan inclined his head. I'll do my best. The cabin door finally swung open. Bright terminal lights spilled into the aircraft, harsh and unblinking. Two uniformed supervisors stood at the entrance, their expressions controlled but watchful. Behind them, airport staff hovered, radios clipped to their belts. Passengers filed out slowly, casting glances back as if reluctant to leave the unfolding drama. A few whispered among themselves. A young woman murmured to her partner, "This is going to be everywhere by morning." Jonathan waited until the aisle cleared, then rose with Ethan. The boy's small hand clung to his father's, his bear tucked under his arm. Together they stepped forward, their presence commanding silence from the crew and staff alike. Samantha felt her stomach twist into knots as they approached. She couldn't stay rooted. She stepped into their path, her eyes downcast, her voice breaking. "Mr. Hayes, Ethan, I know words won't erase what happened, but I need to say this again. I was wrong, not because of your title, not because of consequences, but because I failed to see the people right in front of me. I'm deeply sorry." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Silence stretched between them. Ethan tugged at his father's hand, looking up curiously. "Dad," the boy whispered. "Can people really change?" Jonathan crouched to meet his son's eyes. "Yes, son. People can change when they choose to face the truth." He straightened, turning back to Samantha. "Ms. Cole, what happens next isn't up to me alone. There are procedures, investigations, but know this: if change is what you seek, let it begin not with fear of punishment, but with respect freely given." Her throat tightened. She nodded, tears brimming. The supervisors exchanged glances but said nothing yet. They would handle the matter privately, away from the cabin's gaze. Jonathan and Ethan stepped past them into the jet bridge. Cameras were already visible down the corridor, phones raised by curious passengers who had disembarked earlier. The murmur of voices swelled like waves. Ethan clung closer, overwhelmed by the noise. Jonathan lowered his voice to reassure him. "Stay close, son." Eyes forward, flashbulbs sparked. Someone shouted, "Mr. Hayes, is it true you were mistreated by your own staff?" Another voice followed. "Will there be firings, lawsuits?" Jonathan didn't answer. He walked steadily, his son beside him, his silence more commanding than words. Behind them, Samantha lingered in the doorway, her legs trembling. She wanted to disappear, to avoid the gauntlet of cameras and questions. But another part of her knew this was the crucible. Whether she hid or walked through it would define who she became after tonight. She stepped forward, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. Some cameras swung toward her, capturing the image of the woman at the center of the storm. She heard whispers, felt the weight of judgment, but kept moving. In the terminal, reporters pressed closer, their microphones pointed like spears. Jonathan finally stopped, his voice carrying above the noise. Tonight was not about me. It was about a child who deserved dignity, who represents every passenger who trusts us when they fly. Remember that before you write your headlines. His words silenced the crowd for a beat, their sharpness undeniable. Ethan looked up at his father with pride. Samantha, standing a few steps behind, felt her chest constrict. His defense of dignity wasn't just a rebuke, it was a lifeline, a reminder that she still had a choice. The supervisors ushered her toward a side corridor, preparing to debrief away from the chaos. She glanced once more at Jonathan and Ethan. her heart heavy but strangely lightened by a sliver of hope. Perhaps redemption wasn't lost. As Jonathan led his son through the terminal, Helen Carter caught up briefly, her cane tapping against the polished floor. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a kind smile, "don't let the noise of the world drown the voice of your boy. Tonight, his question is the one that matters most. Can people really change?" Jonathan looked down at Ethan, then back at her. "I suppose we'll find out." They moved forward together, father and son, into the blaze of lights and the awaiting future. The ground had given them back their footing, but the truth they carried would follow them long after this flight. The night air outside the terminal was cool, crisp, and alive with the sounds of a city that never truly slept. Jonathan Hayes guided Ethan through the sliding glass doors, the boy's small hand clutching his father's firmly. Cameras had thinned, the initial frenzy giving way to distant flashes and hushed chatter, yet the echoes of what had happened in the cabin still hung heavy in both of their hearts. For Jonathan, each step forward felt like stepping into another negotiation with himself. He could already envision the phone calls waiting the board demanding answers, public relations officers scrambling for statements, journalists dissecting every angle. But beneath those concerns lay a deeper, quieter truth. This night hadn't been about shareholders or headlines. It had been about his son, about protecting Ethan's dignity when it had been carelessly stripped away. Ethan, despite his exhaustion, kept stealing glances up at his father. He seemed to sense the gravity of what lingered around them. "Dad," he asked softly, "do we have to talk to all those people again tomorrow?" Jonathan slowed, crouching so they were eye to eye. "We might, but remember this. Ethan, no matter what they ask, you just have to be yourself. That's enough." The boy nodded, leaning his head briefly against his father's shoulder. Inside the terminal, in a private corner shielded from reporters, Samantha Cole sat opposite two supervisors. A clipboard rested on the table between them, pages filled with forms she had seen many times before. Tonight, however, she wasn't the witness filling them out. She was the subject. Her chest tightened as the senior supervisor, a woman named Alvarez, folded her hands. "Ms. Cole, the incident tonight cannot be ignored. There will be a formal investigation. You'll be placed on temporary suspension effective immediately." The words struck like stones, but Samantha didn't flinch. Perhaps she had expected worse. Another supervisor, younger and less certain, shifted uncomfortably. "You've been with us for years, Samantha. This doesn't have to be the end, but you need to reflect on what went wrong." Samantha swallowed, her throat dry. "I know what went wrong," she said, her voice low. "I stopped seeing people as people. I let the uniform become a shield instead of a responsibility. I'll take whatever consequence comes. But I don't want to run from this anymore." For the first time in years, her words weren't shaped by fear or pride. They were shaped by truth. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Ethan exited into the quieter stretch of the terminal. Helen Carter approached slowly, her cane clicking against the floor. She had waited, deliberately, to find them away from the cameras. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted, her eyes gentle. "Forgive me if I intrude. I just wanted to say you've shown your boy more than courage tonight. You've shown him what it means to stand with dignity even when the world is watching." Jonathan inclined his head, gratitude softening his features. "Thank you. Though I fear what the world makes of it won't always be kind." Helen's smile deepened. The world rarely is. But kindness isn't born from the world. It's born from people, one choice at a time. Ethan tilted his head. Curious. So, if people keep choosing, things can change. Helen leaned closer, her voice warm as a blanket. Exactly, child. One choice at a time. The boy beamed faintly, as though he had just been entrusted with the secret map. Later that evening, in the quiet of their hotel suite, Jonathan sat by the window overlooking the glowing city. Ethan had fallen asleep curled on the bed, his bear tucked tightly under his chin. The boy's breathing was slow, peaceful at last. Jonathan sipped a glass of water, his mind restless. He thought of Samantha, her trembling apology, the fear in her eyes, the possibility of redemption. He thought of Helen, her wisdom like lanterns guiding a path he wasn't always sure he could walk. He thought of Ethan, his question still echoing. Can people really change? Jonathan had seen enough of the world to know that change was rarely easy, rarely quick, but perhaps tonight had been proof that change was possible even at 35,000 feet, in the tight rows of a crowded cabin, under the harsh fluorescent lights of scrutiny. His phone buzzed. A message from Richard Alvarez, the board member he trusted most. It read, "Crisis meeting scheduled. Public wants blood. We'll talk at dawn." Jonathan sighed, setting the phone aside. Tomorrow would be another storm. But tonight, he allowed himself the quiet victory of having protected his son, of having upheld dignity in a space where it had been carelessly discarded. Across town. Samantha lay awake in her apartment. The silence pressed hard against her ears. For years, she had moved through her life on autopilot, each flight blending into the next, each face blurring into insignificance. But tonight, Ethan's tear-stained eyes haunted her, refusing to let her sleep. For the first time, she admitted to herself that she didn't just fear losing her job, she feared losing her soul. And perhaps, just perhaps, the suspension was not an ending, but the beginning of something truer. She whispered into the darkness, a promise to no one but herself. I will not be the same tomorrow. Back at the hotel, Jonathan rose from his chair and approached Ethan, brushing a strand of hair from his boy's forehead. He whispered softly, though the child could not hear, "Yes. Ethan, people can change, and I'll make sure you grow up believing it." The city lights twinkled outside, reflections mirrored in the glass like distant stars. The night that began with turbulence had ended with truth. And though justice would take its course in boardrooms and press conferences, its truest echo was already alive in the heart of a father, the eyes of a child, and the choice of a woman ready to begin again, because dignity, once defended, reverberates beyond a single flight. It becomes a lesson carried into countless others, and that night, in the quiet skies and restless city below, justice had found its voice not in punishment alone, but in the fragile, powerful echo of change. And so, from takeoff to landing, this flight became more than a journey across the skies. It became a mirror of who we are when power, pride, and prejudice collide. Jonathan Hayes showed us that dignity is not negotiable, that even in silence, strength can roar louder than anger. Ethan reminded us of innocence, of the questions only a child dares to ask, questions that linger long after the engines quiet. And Samantha. She reminded us that mistakes, while painful, can become the doorway to change if we have the courage to walk through. This story is not just about one boy, one father, or one flight attendant. It is about all of us. It asks us to look at the ways we treat strangers, the ways we wield authority, and the ways we choose either to build respect or destroy it. Let us carry forward compassion. Let us confront injustice. And let us remember that silence in the face of cruelty is never neutral. It is a choice. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, let's make sure these stories take flight into more hearts, and never stop asking the questions that lead us closer to justice.